I was thinking about the mental shortcuts we use when we look at people. You see someone jogging, maybe they're really lean, eating a salad, and you instantly think, okay, that person is the picture of health.
It's the halo effect.
Mhm.
We equate thinness with wellness and, fitness with immunity from disease. It's hardwired into us.
It is. And then you see someone who might be carrying a significant amount of extra weight, maybe struggling a bit, and the brain goes to the opposite place. You assume they are the ones at risk. You assume they are the ones the doctor needs to worry about.
Right. It's a pattern matching game we play.
Well, today we are going to talk about a study that takes that specific pattern, specifically regarding endometrial cancer, and completely breaks it. We're deep diving into a massive new piece of research out of Sweden that suggests when it comes to young women, the healthy-looking patient might actually be the one in the most danger.
It's a really counterintuitive finding. We are looking at a nationwide population-based study titled Exploring Endometrial Cancer in Premenopausal Women, a nationwide PremEnCa cohort study. It was just published in Acta Obstetricia et Gynecologica Scandinavia by Oanu and colleagues. And the reason this paper is making waves is that it focuses on a demographic we usually ignore for this disease. Women under 50.
Premenopausal women, which for endometrial cancer, that feels like a contradiction in terms. I always thought this was a disease of postmenopause, something you worry about in your 60s or 70s.
And historically, you aren't wrong. That is the dogma. But that's why this study is so important, is trying to figure out when this old person's disease strikes a 35-year-old or a 40-year-old, is it the same beast? Or is it something different entirely?
And what they found is a paradox. They call it the underweight paradox, which we are definitely going to get into. But before we get to the scary stuff, I want to get a sense of the scale here. Because if I'm listening to this and I'm 35, am I supposed to be panicking?
No, panic is definitely not the reaction here. Let's visualize the numbers to keep everyone calm. The researchers looked at every single woman diagnosed with endometrial cancer in Sweden over an 11-year period, from 2010 to 2021. That is a stadium full of people, almost 16,000 women.
Okay, 16,000 cases, that's the total pool.
Now, imagine zooming in on just the women aged 50 or younger. That number drops to 797. So out of that massive stadium, the young group is just a small section in the bleachers. It's only 5% of all cases.
5%, so the vast majority really are.
They are. The vast majority are older women. And if you look at women under 40, it's even rarer. It's 0.9%. We're talking about 138 women in the entire country of Sweden over more than a decade.
That is surprisingly low. I was reading through the notes, and didn't the study say that globally the number is usually higher? Like, in other countries, young women make up 15% or even 30% of cases.
That stood out to me, too. Sweden is sitting at less than 1% for the under 40 crowd, while the international data is much, much higher.
Why the huge gap? Is there something protective in the water in Stockholm?
It's likely not the water, but it might be the prescriptions. The authors point to the very high usage of combined oral contraceptives and progestin IUDs in Sweden. We know those hormones thin the uterine lining.
So the pill is basically acting like a shield.
Essentially.
Yeah.
By keeping the uterine lining thin for years, you're removing the playground where these cancer cells typically start to multiply. It suppresses the incidence rate dramatically in that younger population.
Okay, so step one. This is rare. But let's say you are one of those 797 women. You get the diagnosis, you're 42 years old. What does your future look like? Because usually when young people get old people diseases, I feel like the prognosis is worse. Like the body just doesn't know how to handle it.
That's often true for things like breast cancer, where young can mean aggressive. But here, the news is incredibly good. The 5-year overall survival rate for these young women was 93.2%.
93%? That's huge.
It's exceptional. If you compare that to the women over 50 in the same study, their survival rate was only around 71%. So being young is a massive survival advantage here.
Is that just because a 40-year-old body is stronger and can handle surgery better than a 70-year-old body? Or is the cancer itself different?
It's a bit of both, but the biology of the tumor plays the biggest role.
Yeah.
We need to talk about histology, which is just a fancy way of asking, what is the personality of the cell?
I like that. Cell personality.
So imagine two types of personalities. First, you have the endometrioid type. These cells are essentially just lazy. They look a lot like normal uterine cells. They grow slowly, and they don't really want to travel anywhere else in the body.
The couch potato of cancer cells.
In a way, yes. And 95% of the young women in this study had this type. That's why the survival rate is so high. They have the lazy cancer.
And the other type?
That's the non-endometrioid type. These are cells like serous carcinoma or clear cell carcinoma. These are the rioters. They are aggressive, chaotic, and they move fast. In women over 50, you see these aggressive types much more often, about 17.5% of the time. But in the young women, it was only 5%.
So, young women are rolling the dice, but the dice are weighted in their favor. They are getting the lazy cells, and they are catching them early.
The staging confirms that. Nearly 70% of the young women were diagnosed at stage IA. That means the cancer was barely a speck. It was still inside the uterus, hasn't even grown halfway through the muscle wall.
Which explains why surgery is often the only treatment they need.
Precisely. If you catch a lazy tumor when it's still small, you cut it out, and the problem is largely solved.
Okay, so we have a picture of a rare disease that is generally survivable, but now we have to talk about the risk factors. And this is where the study starts to mess with my head a little bit, because we are constantly told that obesity is the primary driver of endometrial cancer.
And that biological mechanism is solid. Fat tissue is not just storage, it's active. It converts androgens into estrogens. So if you have excess adipose tissue, you have excess estrogen floating around,
Which feeds the tumor.
It's like throwing fertilizer on a weed. The estrogen stimulates the lining of the uterus to grow and grow until it makes a mistake and becomes cancer. And the data in this study backs that up. 46% of the women in this PremEnCa cohort had obesity. That's almost half.
So if you are obese, you are much more likely to get the cancer. That tracks with everything we know. But here is where I got stuck in the reading. I assumed that if you had the obesity, if you had the fertilizer in your system, the cancer would be worse. I assumed it would work faster and come back sooner.
That is the logical leap, but the data says the opposite. In this study, obesity was not associated with a worse prognosis.
That seems wild.
It is surprising. The women with a BMI of 30 or higher had a 5-year disease-free survival of 94.0%. That is actually slightly higher than the overall average.
So even though the obesity likely caused the cancer, it didn't make the cancer harder to kill.
It seems that the type of cancer obesity causes is almost exclusively that lazy endometrioid type we talked about. It drives the disease, but it drives the good version of the disease.
Okay, that makes sense. High estrogen creates a specific slow-growing tumor, but then who is getting the bad version? Who is getting the aggressive, riotous cells?
This is the underweight paradox, and this is the part that every clinician listening needs to really hear. The researchers isolated a small subgroup of women, about 40 of them, who had a BMI of less than 20.
So these are lean women, maybe underweight, maybe just naturally very thin.
And when they looked at this group, the safety net disappeared. These thin women were significantly less likely to be diagnosed at stage IA. They were catching it later.
Why? Because they didn't have symptoms.
They likely had symptoms, but think about the clinical bias we started with. A 35-year-old woman with a BMI of 19 comes in with some spotting. Does the doctor think cancer?
No, they think stress. They think, oh, you overexercised. Or maybe a polyp. They certainly don't rush her to a biopsy.
But if a 35-year-old woman with a BMI of 35 comes in with the same spotting,
the doctor sees the weight, knows the link to cancer, and orders the test.
that bias causes a delay. But it's not just the delay. The biology was different too. This underweight group had a much higher rate of those aggressive, non-endometrioid tumors.
The riot cells.
Yes, about 13% of the lean women had the aggressive type compared to only 2.5% of the obese women. That is a 5-fold difference.
That is massive. So the thin women are getting a nastier cancer, and we are ignoring them because they look healthy.
And the survival numbers reflect that tragedy. The 5-year disease-free survival for the underweight group dropped to 76.1%.
That's a nearly 20-point drop compared to the obese group.
It is. In the statistical analysis, they found that having a BMI under 20 gave a hazard ratio of 2.57 for recurrence or death.
Let's break that hazard ratio down. That sounds terrifying.
Think of it like driving on a highway. If the standard risk of crashing is 1, a hazard ratio of 2.57 means you are more than 2.5 times as likely to have that crash compared to the other drivers. Now, I have to add the scientific asterisk here. When they adjusted for everything else, like tumor type and stage, that number lost its statistical significance.
Meaning the thinness itself isn't killing them.
The thinness is the red flag. The tumor type is the killer. Lean women get the aggressive non-hormonal cancers. But because the sample size was so small, only 39 women, the statistics get a little fuzzy, but the signal is clear. Do not ignore the lean patient.
It essentially defines a non-classical patient profile. You have the classic patient, heavier metabolic issues, estrogen-driven, good outcome, and the non-classic, thin, no metabolic issues, aggressive tumor, dangerous outcome.
That's the takeaway. We have to stop thinking of this as purely a disease of obesity.
Right.
In young women, the absence of obesity might actually mask a more dangerous enemy.
I want to pivot to another finding in this study that I found fascinating, and it's about money. Usually when we cover medical studies, there is this depressing chapter where we find out that socioeconomic status dictates who lives and who dies.
The wealth gap in health. It's almost always there.
But not here.
Not here. The researchers looked at education level. They looked at country of birth, whether the women were born in Sweden or immigrated. They used these as proxies for socioeconomic status. And they found zero significant association between these factors and the tumor stage at diagnosis.
So being poor or an immigrant didn't mean you were diagnosed later.
No. Everyone was getting caught at roughly the same stage.
That is unheard of in U.S. data.
It is. In the U.S., we know that lack of insurance or lower income leads to delayed diagnosis, which leads to later stages and worse survival. In this Swedish study, that variable was essentially wiped out.
Because of the healthcare system?
Universal healthcare acts as a massive equalizer. It basically removes access to care as a variable in the experiment. It allows us to see the pure biology of the disease without the noise of poverty.
That is such a powerful insight. It proves that the poverty gap in cancer isn't biological, it's structural. If you fix the system, the gap closes.
It's a compelling argument for standardized care. The only factor that did correlate with a later stage diagnosis was family history.
Meaning genetics.
Yes. If a woman had a first-degree relative mom or sister with cancer, she was more likely to have a later stage tumor. This hints at things like Lynch syndrome, where the cancers are just naturally more aggressive or harder to detect early.
Let's talk about the women who survive. We established that 93% make it past 5 years. But some women did die. There were 74 deaths in the cohort. What happened to them?
This brings us back to the whole patient concept. Out of 74 deaths, only 36 were actually caused by the endometrial cancer.
So half of them died from something else.
And 23 of those were other malignancies, other cancers in the bowel, ovaries, breast. Again, pointing to that genetic susceptibility. But here's the shocker. In U.S. studies of older women, cardiovascular disease is a huge killer of cancer survivors.
Because obesity damages the heart.
Right, but in this young Swedish cohort, only one death was associated with metabolic disease.
One death out of nearly 800 women.
Just one.
Is that just because they are young?
Age is a big factor. A 30-year-old heart can handle the strain of obesity better than a 70-year-old heart. But it also suggests that these women are, aside from the cancer, relatively robust. It highlights that if we cure the cancer, we need to keep an eye on other cancers. The surveillance plan needs to change. Don't just scan the pelvis. Check the colon, check the breasts.
Speaking of checking the rest of the life, we are talking about women in their reproductive years. Did many of them try to save their fertility? I know you can sometimes treat early cancer with hormones instead of a hysterectomy to bide time for a pregnancy.
That option exists, but in this study, the uptake was incredibly low. Only about 3% of the women opted for fertility-preserving treatment.
That feels very low for women under 40.
It does. It raises a lot of questions. Are doctors not offering it? Or are the patients just so terrified by the C word that they say, just take it out. I don't care about having another baby. I just want to live.
I can imagine that fear. You hear cancer and your priorities shift instantly.
There is also the issue of life after the surgery. If you remove the ovaries in a 35-year-old, you send her into immediate surgical menopause.
Which is brutal. Hot flashes, bone density loss, brain fog.
And usually we treat menopause with hormone replacement therapy. But in this group, only 14% used hormones after surgery.
Because they are afraid of feeding the beast.
That's the prevailing fear.
Mm-hmm.
Estrogen caused my cancer, so I can't take estrogen. But for early-stage endometrioid cancer, the data suggests it's actually quite safe. The authors argue that we might be denying these young women quality of life and heart protection out of an abundance of caution that isn't backed by data.
It sounds like we have a lot of abundance of caution causing problems here. Caution about giving hormones, caution about diagnosis based on weight.
Medicine is often conservative, but sometimes that conservatism creates blind spots.
So let's bring this all together. We've covered a lot of ground from the lazy cells to the riot cells, the protective power of the Swedish pill, and the equalizer of universal healthcare. If you had to summarize the PremEnCa patient, who is she?
She's typically in her 40s. She often carries extra weight, which likely contributed to her diagnosis. But she has an excellent prognosis because her tumor is slow-growing and caught early. Surgery cures her, and she goes on to live a normal life.
That's the standard profile. But we need to leave the listener with the other profile, the one that keeps slipping through the cracks.
The non-classical patient, the young, lean woman, the one who doesn't look sick.
The underweight paradox.
Exactly. This study is a wake-up call that healthy weight is not a shield against aggressive cancer. In fact, in this specific disease, being lean might be a marker for a much more dangerous fight.
It challenges the bias we all carry. If we are wrong about the healthy-looking patient being safe, what other biases are we bringing to the clinic? Who else are we ignoring because they don't fit the checklist?
That is the question we should be asking, because biology doesn't care about our checklist. It just follows its own rules.
And for anyone listening who has been through this or knows someone who has, the message seems to be advocacy matters. If something feels wrong, it doesn't matter what you weigh or how old you are, get it checked.
Absolutely. And once you beat it, remember to take care of the rest of you. The heart, the genetics, the whole picture.
Thank you for unpacking this with me. It's rare, but it's fascinating, and understanding it might just change how we look at healthy.
Thanks for having me.
See you next time on The Deep Dive.